What is that I see? Is that an electrical socket without a child safety lock? I sure hope I don't touch this and get zapped so hard I see my skeleton. Ooh, I sure hope I don't get jolted and wiggle around so you can see my bones as I'm getting zapped with electricity. Oh no, I would hate for that to happen. Okay, here I go. What is electricity and how does it work in my game? Well, to answer the first question... What are you watching, son? You know what electricity is. And to answer the second question, electricity is one of the elemental systems that is in my game, and also a mechanic used in some of the puzzles and world objects. Objects can either be electric, conductive, or non-conductive. Electricity will pass and conduct through conductive objects and be stopped by non-conductive objects. Electricity is created by combining the slime and smoke elements together. The lore explanation for this is that slime is quite volatile and smoke makes it a gassy more object to it, so it becomes a volatile gassy object and becomes an electrical object. When an object is electrical, it will check for its collisions around it and check what it can conduct its electricity to. So, if it is a block, it will check in a radius around itself as to what can be conducted or spread its electricity into. Combining ice and slime together freezes the ice and makes metal. Metal can conduct electricity, water can conduct electricity, mist can conduct electricity because it is watery. Soap and snow can also conduct electricity. This may not make the most logical sense, but they are watery elements, so I felt like they could probably conduct electricity. If you think about it for a long time, they probably couldn't conduct electricity, but at a glance it makes sense that they conduct electricity. What I wanted to do with this system is have roughly 1/3 of the elements that you could create be ones that can conduct electricity, so you can use these in your setups for puzzle solutions. But how does our conductivity actually work? If we have our setup of objects here, we can turn one of them into electric, and you can envision a collider around it, and this will be the objects around this object that its electricity can be passed into. If any object enters or exits this collision around it, we will then check for the electricity conductivity and update it accordingly. Right now, none of these objects are electrical, so the electrical current cannot be passed into these. But if we change one of these to a different element, for example metal, then the electrical object will be able to detect that the electricity can be passed into this object, and it will then pass its current into this object. All this does is it adds that collider of the object that the electricity is being passed into as a possible electrical conduit collider. Now in any further collision checks, the electrical object is going to check its own collision object, as in its radius around itself, and it's going to check the collision radius of the object it is colliding with. So it's going to check its own radius, and then the radius of the metal object touching it. So it's then following itself and extending its range based on what is touching it. You can see as more objects become electrical or become electrical conduits, that these objects are being added to this collider string, and these are essentially passing the electricity through itself by just enabling these objects as can conduct electricity to it, and is going to be checked with the electrical object as potential places the electricity can be passed to. To streamline the system quite a lot, I'm also going to check if there are any other electrical objects in this list of objects that we are checking the electricity of. If there is another electrical object in this list, we're going to add it to the original electrical object circuit list, and it's going to check its collision through itself. But then this second electrical object is not going to check for its own circuitry moving, because it's already being checked with the original object that is checking its own circuitry moving. Basically, if it's already part of an electrical circuit that has been checked for more further collision and further spreading, it doesn't need to then check itself again for collision and spreading, because it's just going to retrieve the same information that the first one did, and therefore we can just rely on the first object, that is the electrical object, to check for the collision, and any further ones can just ignore the system because it is already being fulfilled by the first object setup. One element of complexity to this is that the electrical objects can be destroyed, or they can be moved away from the objects that they're colliding with. If they get destroyed or moved away, the electricity isn't going to be passed through the other objects, and the circuit will break. But how do I go about doing this? First of all, if the electrical object has been moved away from a circuit that is containing no other electrical objects, these other electrical objects will check the last time that they had an element of electric pass through into them. If it has been a certain allotted amount of time, these are going to be turned off, and they're going to turn anything that they are powering with their adjacent circuitry off as well. Essentially meaning that the current is going to flow through them for a very short amount of time, but because there is no further electrical current flowing into them, they're going to turn off and then turn anything that they are touching and powering off as well. This means you cannot power something, make a metal object charge of electricity, and then remove the electrical object and somehow have the circuit maintain itself with perpetual collision with other electrified objects when there is not a source block of electricity touching them. For an electrical circuit to work in the game, it has to have at least one electrical object touching it that is powering the circuit, otherwise the electricity is not going to be flowing from anything and is going to break. Is this realistic to real life? I don't know. I have an arts degree, but it sure does work well for the game. I think in terms of puzzle solutions, metal make electric flow through is pretty simple enough and fine enough for the system that I have. Then we have the actual mechanism for how electricity will work as a game mechanic and puzzle mechanic. There are certain objects in my game called electrical sensors. These are little bubbles, and they look like those little balls that you would touch with your hand and the electric touches you. You know the ones. These, as a mechanic, will be triggered into an on or off state, depending on if they have electrical flowing into them. These will then trigger other mechanism objects, such as doors or bridges, and will tell these objects to be turned on or off if the electricity is flowing into this object. The way this functions in-game is pretty simple. I have the electrical conduit set up on these objects to always be a conductive object, and then I have the mechanism object checking if this object is having electricity flowed into it or is electrified itself. If it is, we'll have the mechanism open or close depending on what the setup of the mechanism is. This is a pretty fun puzzle solution. I like the specificity of this in useful puzzle solutions. The fact that the player has to have an electrical element flowing into this in some way in order to solve the puzzle. I think this is very interesting. I already have a couple ideas. For example, it has a button below the electrical conduit and the conduit is hanging, and you have to have electricity flow into it while also not triggering the button in some way because that will break some other further element of the puzzle. So you have to have something flow into it but also not be below it and touching it. I think that's a pretty fun solution for this puzzle, or a pretty fun puzzle that could be in the game. Point is, game fun. All this being said, I just like adding new mechanics and new puzzle mechanisms that are not specifically the spellbook. I think it is interesting to the game to include things that are not specifically spells and some things that are adjacent to the spells you can use. Then we have the way that the electricity affects the player. The player can also conduct electricity into them, being a person adjacent thing. Much like you and I, we can conduct electricity through our bodies, but once. The player can also conduct electricity through themselves. This triggers the electrical state unless they are already in a substate that can safely have electricity flowing through them, such as the puddle or metal state. But if they are turned into an electrical state, they will become a funny little skeleton that is conducting electricity. If they cast the element of electricity on themselves, they will be in this state for 10 seconds, the same way as any other state transformation that the player can engage in. But if they have electricity flowing into them from another object, they will be in this state just until the electricity flows into them. This is another very, very fun mechanic. The player can be used to conduct an electrical circuit and finish a circuit. I think this is very funny. I really enjoy the player being able to conduct electricity through themselves and become a little skeleton. I think the idea of being able to finish a puzzle or finish a circuit with your own body is a really, really fun mechanic, and I'm excited to see what puzzles can completely be ignored because the player can just become an electrical battery. The visual for this is the player going between a few different electrified poses using cartoons. you touch the electric and you become funny skeleton cartoon. The actual animation behind this is pretty simple. I have the base pose and then I have a slightly altered version of this pose with the bones and body moving back a little bit as if being pushed backwards, and they just go between these electrical poses as they are being zapped and have a background visual element behind them and the electricity coming off them. Very, very simple pose to draw for. This is one of my favorite visual poses. I think this turned out so well. This and the on fire pose are the elemental states that are just harming the player, and I think they look really, really funny and are very, very funny to play. Next we have the actual electrical visuals for the things that are not the player. The actual objects that become electric have a very interesting visual style, I feel. They have a big yellow circle and then a black harsh shading on them. I think this is very interesting and very unique. The reason that the electrical shader had to be one of the more unique ones is because it is also one of the last elements I had already created, and I want elements to be very visually different and I want them to be very colorly different. Unfortunately, all of the colors were taken. There's a lot of different elements and a lot of them share some color overlap. For example, accelerant, which is a gas that makes you move faster, also is a very similar color to electricity. So to offset this, I also make the electrical material very, very unique. It is a very, very, very intense yellow and a very intense black, which I feel like even next to other yellow materials and other yellow elements does make it stand out quite a lot. Then the particle system is, as always, an animated particle system with the texture sprites swapping as the animation plays, and it just has a different set of electrical zaps that create and fade away over time. This is then changed with the actual particle system's lifetime, blah blah blah. It's a fun particle system that I just drew an animation for. Finally, we have the actual objects and state systems that can interfere with the electricity. These are very minor somehow. The electricity hadn't ended up being a pretty stable system somehow, but it has some awkward complexities to it. As stated, if you destroy an object, it will be destroyed, and then the electrical current will stop being flowed through this object, and the circuitry will stop itself. But I've added a system where an object can become intangible. This means it has no collision whatsoever and is floating for a set period of time until it pops back into existence. So if you make the electricity intangible, it has to still exist but not conduct its electricity to other objects because the object technically doesn't exist at the same time. In this setup, I disable the electricity when an object is intangible and re-enable it back again when the object is tangible once again. As a bit of ease of realizing why this is, I also make the particle systems disappear and reappear when becoming and not becoming intangible, so you can easily tell which electrical objects are on and which are in another plane of reality, and you can kind of just see them. And the other weird little complexity is, what if the player is inside of a body of water that is being electrified? The player can swim in any body of water and any object can become water. What if you electrify them? Well, in this setup, I make the player pop out of the water, skim on the water's surface, and be electrified. It was a bit too complicated to make the player be electrified while swimming in the water because there would have to technically be the swimming state and the electrified state at the same time, and that was a bit too complicated for the way the system is set up already, and I also felt didn't particularly read very well. If I was swimming in water in a cartoony situation and I got electrified by the electrified water, I feel like organically, in my mind, what is more a thing that makes sense is that the player would be electrified and zapped out of the water very quickly. So in this sense, you're skimming on top of the water because you're being zapped every time you land in it and you're bouncing off it.
Anyway, devlog over. Bye.
It's the end of the devlog section. The electric element originally was not planned to be something that was an element, and it was more planned to be something like the portals or the magnetics, where instead of being some element, it would instead be a logic that is assigned to something, but I felt like it, being an element, matched it a bit more in the gameplay, and also filled out some of the elemental spots that I was having a bit more trouble thinking of something unique and fun to use for it. So I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, and I'm pretty happy with its organic inclusion in the elemental system. The elemental system is probably the best part of the game. Or in my opinion has a lot of the more fun interactions that you can play about with. It was also a mechanic that I was very debating on including or not including, because I was originally thinking that maybe the electrical system would be a bit too convoluted for players, and I wasn't particularly sure of how it would work with every other system, but now that it's added into the game, it actually turned out to be quite a simple system, and as with most systems that I planned for, way easier than I anticipated actually adding it to the game. It ended up being one of the more simple systems, which I'm a big fan of. Since there is quite a lot of mechanics that I have already included, let me know in the comments if there are any mechanics that you see in the game that I have not discussed so far that you would be interested on seeing a video on next. Because there's a lot. There's a lot of mechanics. I don't know if you've noticed, the game has a lot of stuff in it, and there's a lot of things you can do. It's a bit confusing. Devlog over, bye, I love you. Mwah.